Hello everybody, in this lesson we will review the theory concerning first language acquisition. We'll look at the different stages of development and all of the theories that try to explain how language acquisition takes place. First of all, we need to say that first language acquisition is an incredible tour de force because within just 3 years and under normal circumstances, all of the children acquire the language within the first 3 years of life, which is an incredible achievement that is systematic and that is creative at the same time. Throughout the process of first language acquisition, children will go through some distinctive stages of development. First of all, from 0 to 12 months, they go through a pre-linguistic stage. Then from 12 to 18 months, the one-word stage. Then later on, from 18 to 24 months, there will be the two-word stage, then the telegraphic stage from 24 to 30 months, and finally, after 30 months, they will go to the multi-word stage, in which they have achieved full communicative competence in their first language. Let's look at the stages in more detail. First of all, in the pre-linguistic stage, the children will produce just some basic sounds like crying and cooing and babbling. And of course, at this stage, the most important process is sound recognition, and then these patterns that are the phonological patterns that are established from this early age. Then, in the one-word stage, the most important thing to mention is that they go through this holophrastic stage. In other words, they're going to produce one word, but this word is going to have the meaning of a whole sentence. They will express their ideas using a single word. Like milk will mean I want some milk. Then there is the two-word stage, and as the name suggests, in this stage, babies combine two words to create simple sentences, usually a subject plus a verb or a verb plus an object. The next stage is the telegraphic stage, and as the name suggests, in this stage they're going to produce longer sentences between 3 and 4 words, but the problem is that these sentences are going to lack grammar words. So no articles, no prepositions, no conjunctions. A typical example would be daddy go car, meaning that daddy went out in his car. And then after the 30 months, we're going to have the multi-word stage, which is like the final stage of language acquisition. And in this stage, of course, they can produce more complex, adult-like sentences with function words and some emergent morphology. Now, something important to mention about the stages of development is that they're generally consistent across languages, so it doesn't matter what language the child is acquiring, like Chinese or Japanese or German. These stages are consistent across languages. Of course, there is some individual variation, but we can see clearly distinctive stages of development that are pretty much universal. And the second thing that we need to mention is that acquisition is a continuous process, so it's difficult to see when children move from one stage to the other because the process is continuous, and obviously the stages will sometimes overlap. So the next question is, how are children able to develop full competence in a language within just 3 years of life, going from zero knowledge of the language to basically full functional competence in a language? So there are different theories that explain how babies acquire language. Before we move on to the explanation of the different language acquisition theories, it is important to see their basic foundations. First of all, some theories based on basic biological dimensions of human beings, focus on behavior. Some others will try to explain the process from the point of view of cognition, that is the rational dimension of human beings, and some others will focus on the social dimension. That means that the interactive nature of language and the fact that humans are social beings. So let's look at the most important theories in first language acquisition: behaviorism, nativism, social interactionism, the usage-based theory, cognitivism, and connectionism. So as we can remember, behaviorism is based on the groundbreaking work by B.F. Skinner, stimulus, response, reinforcements, and then learning by imitation and by repetition. And nativism, basically, this theory was developed by Noam Chomsky, and he talks about the innate nature of language. So there are some concepts such as the language acquisition device that contains the universal grammar that is going to be activated, by the external sources. And then social interactionism, some of the most important researchers in this theory, of course, Lev Vygotsky, with the sonoproximal development and scaffolding, right? And then Bruner developed the theory a little bit further to talk about social interaction and the language acquisition support system, or LAS. And then the usage-based theory, by Tomasello, in which they emphasize the importance of language use in social context. That means that we learn the language by means of functional communication. We learn the language by using it in social context. Then cognitivism, right, in which Jean Piaget outlines different stages of cognitive development, and these stages of cognitive development are going to precede language acquisition, so they will go like kind of hand in hand with it. And finally, we have this theory of connectionism, in which, of course, some of the most important concepts are the input. The input is central in this theory, but in this case, we say that language acquisition is going to proceed by means of neural connections that are established by the statistical learning of patterns by a constant, continuous, and extensive exposure to inputs. Behaviors theory is probably the oldest one, or the kind of the first theory, and we have this first work by B.F. Skinner, verbal behavior, and the principle was very simple. According to Skinner, language was another kind of behavior. So he said there's nothing special about someone who's verbalizing, because they're simply being the locus at which linguistic or language behavior is taking place. In other words, we acquire language in the same way as we acquire any other kind of behavior, by means of stimulus, response, reinforcement, operant conditioning. So the model is very simple if we remember, like we have here a neutral signal or a conditional stimulus. There's no response because there's no emotional meaning. So this sound of the bell is meaningless to the dog. And then there are some other kind of stimuli that are unconditioned. This means that they are reflexive. For example, when the dog sees the food, this reflex of salivating is going to be activated, because this reflex is hardwired, to basic needs related to survival. So the dog is going to salivate upon seeing the food. But then we can relate these two stimuli, right? So the ringing of the bell will precede the giving of the food, which is going to cause this reflex or respondent behavior. If we repeat this process many times, what is going to happen is that the dog is going to start salivating by the simple ringing of the bell, because he will have associated the ringing of the bell to the giving of food, and therefore this conditioned response will be created and reinforced. So behaviorists will say that this process is the same for language acquisition. So there's going to be some stimulus that is going to be provided, in this case a linguistic stimulus, right? For example, the mother will say to the baby, "Mom, mom." And upon repetition of this pattern or this stimulus, there's going to be a response from the baby eventually, because then one day the baby is going to say mom. So the mom is going to be extremely happy, and she's going to hug and kiss the baby, and there's going to be such excitement all around the baby that the behavior is going to be reinforced, and therefore we will have, like a similar process of operant conditioning. There's like some response that has been reinforced to create linguistic behavior. Now let's look at cognitivism. Here we said Jean Piaget, he developed this theory of cognitive development, but he also focused on language and thought. So in his work, Jean Piaget came to the conclusion that to be able to develop the language to express concepts, the child needed to develop these concepts first. In other words, cognitive development preceded linguistic development. So the model here establishes that language follows conceptual understanding, as we already said, that language mirrors cognitive development, they go hand in hand, and that the egocentric speech of the child is developmental. So this means that it is a process of maturation that is going to be established. The child is going to produce language without really considering people outside, just to practice and reinforce, while the maturity takes place, and therefore this is going to become inner speech, just thoughts. And so they also mention, or Piaget mentioned this process. There are schemas that are developed, in other words, like some kind of rules about concepts or language, and then these are going to be generalized to other concepts, which is assimilation. And then this is going to cause some mistakes, because remember that language is irregular. There are irregular plurals, irregular past tenses, and so on. So there's going to be a process of accommodation in which the child is going to learn the irregularities of the language. So now let's look at nativism. Here we have Chomsky, right? Language in Mind, which was re-edited in 2006. And what Chomsky said was that language was unique to humans. In other words, that it is the essence of humans to develop language, and therefore we were programmed to learn the language. Language was innate. So according to Chomsky's theory, there is input, but this input is not important, or is not very important, because it's only the trigger that is going to activate the language acquisition system, device, the language acquisition device, right? And then this universal grammar that is already contained in the brain, in the language acquisition device, is going to be activated and then processed to the particular language. Remember that the universal grammar is supposed to contain, the information about the grammar of all of the languages. So the input is just going to activate that. So there's some processing and there can be some output. So in other words, the only value of the input is to activate or to trigger the universal grammar that is already inside the child's brain. Nativist theory try to explain why it is impossible to learn to develop, the language competence just from the input, because they, according to Chomsky, the performance, which is different from the competence, is viewed as, like bad quality. So the things that adult people say to the child, sometimes they have grammar errors, they are inconsistent, there are lots of false starts and things like that. So he called that the poverty of the stimulus, and he said no, children cannot acquire the language following this model of the input, because it's wrong, because it's so faulty. They have some internal grammar, and the input only activates this information that is already inside the child's brain. So basic principle, right? Language is innate, the lad, and the universal grammar. Another point is that there is a critical period of language acquisition. So Chomsky said that we could acquire the language as children, but later on it was going to be more difficult or almost impossible because the brain lost plasticity, and this is called the critical period hypothesis. And finally, Chomsky tried to explain that children do not acquire simple elements. In other words, they don't imitate just words, they develop grammar rules. And he used some examples of overgeneralizations in the in child speech. So children will say I goed instead of I went, or they will add plural like to some words, like instead of saying feet they will say foot. And according to Chomsky, this is a proof that children are not just imitating and repeating things, they are creating, developing the rules of the language. Now let's move on to explain social interactionism. So basic theory here comes from Vygotsky, obviously, right? In this from this book, Mind and Society, and then later on, Jerome Bruner, Child's Talk, Learning to Use the Language. So a basic principle of this theory is that language is learned by using it to communicate needs, wishes, intentions, and to conduct joint action with another. So in other words, it's not just getting input, but participating in some kind of interaction where there's going to be negotiation of meaning, where there's going to be some elements like scaffolding and the zone of proximal development that are going to help the child to develop the rules of the language. So according to this model, right, there's a child, but this child is surrounded by lots of people because the child is inserted into a society, a family, right? So there are going to be adults and also other peers with more knowledge than the baby, obviously, right? And these people are going to interact with the children so that children can develop this zone of proximal development, right? So the knowledge of the other people and the knowledge of the child are different, and so the child is going to be able to do more with the help of other people than what he or she will be able to do by themselves. And so we call this process scaffolding. And very importantly also that social interactionist theory look at some other elements like mediation through cultural tools. So children develop in a society where there are culture, there is culture, and there are customs, and there are routines, and these are going to be important in shaping, the linguistic development of the child. Now let's talk about one very important concept in social interactionist theory. Jerome Bruner came with the concept of language acquisition support system, which is like the equivalent of the language acquisition device, but in interactionist terms. So he says, in adult-child communication, the formats are very well established and structured. So they are repeated routines, feeding, bathing, playing, and then in these routines, the adults model and guide communication to help the child. And then this language acquisition device obviously involves a lot of scaffolding because adults anticipate, they interpret, and then expand on children's communicative attempts. In other words, that the adult is going to complement, to fix, and even to interpret what the child is saying, and this help is going to be important in language development. Of course, the crucial element here is child-directed speech, also called motherese or baby talk, which is simplified, exaggerated language that helps children to parse, to analyze, to how can I say this, to determine the different elements in the linguistic input. And then of course, we said it before, cultural embeddedness. Language learning is or takes place in a cultural medium where there are practices, and these practices are going to be are going to have meaning because there is this relationship between the things that are done and the things that are said in these cultural practices. So let's look at the characteristics of child-directed speech. First of all, of course, slower and clear pronunciation. We do this for some reason instinctively, to help the child distinguish the words. And there are more pauses in the talk, especially between words and phrases. It's like we're trying to show the child, like the individual words or phrases, right? But this is instinctive, okay? We don't think about it. It's of course the pitch is higher. We use our little voices to talk to children, not the big voices. There's also exaggerated intonation and stress. We're going to use simple vocabulary and lots of diminutive. The characteristics of child-directed speech are that we use concrete language. We always talk about objects in the immediate environment. We focus on the here and the now to provide some context for the child to understand. We use simple structures, lots of imperatives. There are fewer false starts, like we try to have full, complete sentences for some reason. And of course, child-directed speech is redundant in repetitions. We say the same phrase over and over again. We change it, we transform it. Pretty much what, the thing that we do in the audiolingual method for language teaching. And then there is joint attention. And this is very important, that both the adult or the caretaker and the child are involved in a common activity where there is joint attention, and therefore the child can make more sense out of what is happening and what is being said. So this concept of language acquisition support system, or LAS, was very important for Bruner, because he says it's not just the LAD but also the LAS that makes it possible for a child to develop communicative competence in their first language. Now let's look at connectionism. So here we have like two big names. First of all, this work, Parallel Distributed Processing by McLellan and Rumelhart in 86, and then more recently, Connectionism in Second Language Acquisition by Yashiro Shirai, 2018. And here, the most important principle is that language learning happens as a result of neural connections that are formed through exposure to patterns in the language inputs. So we can see that connectionist theory is based on two main tenets. First of all, parallel distributed processing. It means that language processing is not as simple as we think. It happens at multiple levels in the brain, by means of lots of neural connections, and not just a simple sequence of rules. And secondly, emergentism. So this means that like language development is an emergent process, in the sense that it comes out of simple developmental processes interacting with a complex environment. That means that there's a lot of output outside, and of course this output, this continuous exposure to the output is going to make the child detect some patterns that are going to be acquired. So this challenges completely the idea of an innate language acquisition device. We need input to get the patterns, and these patterns are going to be analyzed in the brain, not just emerge from it out of nothing. So reviewing some basic principles in connectionism, we will say that we learn through exposure. In other words, the language is acquired by detecting patterns in input over time, not by internalizing or creating rules. There's also distributed representation. That means that the knowledge isn't stored in some discrete symbols, but it's like a product of connections across networks of interconnected units. And of course, acquisition is going to be gradual and probabilistic, which means that incremental learning. We're going to learn little by little, and this is going to increase by repeated exposure. Errors, of course, are possible, but they're only part of the process because we will adjust according to the things that we see in the input. And we don't create explicit grammar rules, but actually this competence emerges from statistical regularities in the input. In other words, we see forms in the input, and we see how statistically important these are, and the ones that are constant are going to be kept, whereas the other ones that are random are probably going to be forgotten. Then there is generalization and overgeneralization, which basically says that the learners can generalize things from input, such as saying go instead of went, but later they're going to refine these patterns when they find them in the input. And this happens because there are many more regular verbs in any language than irregular verbs, and so statistically they will see more regular verbs and they will think that the ending is ed, but then later the irregular verbs will appear and they will adjust and refine these linguistic patterns. So we can clearly see that there's like this kind of relationship between connectionism and machine learning, because in language acquisition, the children acquire language by being exposed to incredible amounts of input from their environment, right? And natural language processors like ChatGPT or others are trained on massive data sets of text. So it's pretty much similar. And of course, the babies are going to learn patterns implicitly without any explicit instruction. They're going to develop this implicitly, and in the same way, the NLP models are going to learn statistical patterns in text or audio, such as word co-occurrences and syntactic structures and contextual relationships, just by seeing how important they are statistically in the inputs. So once again, it is important to remember the foundations of acquisition theories. So some of them focus on the biological dimension of human beings, some other on the cognitive or rational dimension, and some others in the social dimension of human beings, and they focus on interaction. So we have behaviorism, right, and then cognitivism, nativism, and connectivism that focus on cognition, and finally like usage-based theory and social interactionism that focus on the social dimension. So as a conclusion, we can say, first of all, that each of these theories addresses a different dimension of human nature, and of course they make a different valuable contribution. We should also say that some of the concepts of different theories will overlap, right? Input versus stimulus versus child-directed speech. It's the same thing, right? The language that the child is exposed to. You can call it stimulus, you can call it input, you can call it child-directed speech. And obviously, last but not least, it is important to say that no single theory can provide a complete and extensive explanation of the complexities of first language acquisition. So we need all of them to really make sense of this complex and incredible process of developing competence in our first language. So this was a quick overview of first language acquisition. I hope that it will be useful, and I will be seeing you next time.